The Adelaide Jail was built in 1841 and held roughly 300,000 prisoners until shutting in 1988. This makes it the longest functioning jail in Australia. The Adelaide Jail is rich in history and notorious for its executions of many violent criminals. However, despite the many fascinating stories, the story of Sarah Francisco remains one of the most famous of all.
Sarah Francisco was a well-known figure of Port Adelaide, holding the highest number of convictions in South Australia. Often a chaotic result of alcohol consumption, it landed her many years in jail. Sarah's life story is a complicated one filled with tragedy, triumph and redemption. Her humorous approach to life and crimes made her a well-known figure around the port, and her name is still known to this day.
Sarah Waring was born in Ireland in 1839. She lost her mother at a young age and grew up with her aunt on a farm. Times were tough though, as the Great Potato Famine struck Ireland, so like many other Irish people did at the time, she migrated to Australia in search of a better life. She arrived in Port Adelaide on the 7th of November 1866 to live with her sister. Shortly after moving to Port Adelaide, Sarah met an Italian sailor named John Francisco. They got married on the 19th of November 1867.
It was a very, very unhappy marriage. He was violent, physically, mentally. He used to do some terrible things to her. One particular episode details when he hit her with some sort of piece of metal, and apparently she bore the scar from this across her face for the rest of her life. However, the marriage did produce 2 children, John and Joseph, and she apparently was a very caring mother.
Shortly after, John Francisco abandoned Sarah and the children, leaving her to provide for them on her own.
Obviously there was no welfare system in those days. Sarah had to provide for herself and her children. She used to go off and do things like clean hotels, sell vegetables. There's stories that she used to leave sometimes at 3 a.m. in the morning to go off to do these jobs that she did. This is probably how she became known quite well around the port area too. And sometimes she'd take the children with her. So it was quite a difficult life for her, I think, trying to put bread on the table virtually for her and the children.
Things took a turn for a worse when her son Joseph came into her work to deliver some tragic news that her son John was involved in an accident.
John had fallen down somewhere, and anyway she went out and found he'd fallen down some sort of a hole somewhere, and he virtually died in her arms. And they felt that this was probably the beginning of her downward spiral into alcoholism and all the other troubles that she got into from that time, because she was so devastated by the loss of her son.
This is when Sarah's reputation became notorious in the port area, with her first arrest happening in 1872.
Sarah had a lot of offences, mainly brought about by alcohol, more than anything. I mean, she was charged with things like drunkenness, indecent language, assault, resisting police, riotous behaviour, abusive language and disturbing peace. Sarah was known really as probably the most notorious woman prisoner in Adelaide Jail, and apparently once she got there it was always she wanted her cell. She had what was called her own cell.
However, one day when she arrived at the jail, she found that her own cell was not available.
So at that point she threw off a hat and a shawl and kicked the officer in the shins and created a big fight, and from that she was sentenced to another 14 days in jail, 7 of them just on bread and water. The magistrate placed her under the Aborigines Act simply because the Aborigines weren't allowed to drink, and so they thought if they placed her under that act, well then the hoteliers would not serve her. So what she did was painted herself black, I guess with boot polish, and she would go around the port declaring that she was an Aboriginal.
As Sarah's charges increased, so did her reputation. She was known for her careless attitude towards authority and for her pranks and mischievous crimes. She quickly became a local celebrity around the port and was written about frequently in newspapers, describing her funny crimes and outbursts in court.
Quite often she was so hilarious in court that they'd have, like, the whole court would be laughing at her, the way that she was screaming at the magistrate, the judge, and calling the police for everything she could think of. So she was entertaining, I'm sure. She'd spent 16 years in jail, but if they'd been served for the full length of the convictions, she would have spent 180 years in jail.
Sarah's alcohol-fueled lifestyle continued into her mid-70s, as she was still getting locked up in the Adelaide jail. In 1912, she committed her last crime, making a total of 295 convictions, but to many people's surprise, she pled guilty and was released to the Salvation Army home instead of the jail. This marks the beginning of her new life, as she started volunteering for the Salvation Army and would walk around the port collecting donations.
So she would go around and ask for donations. Nobody ever said no, because she was so well known. She even went back to the Adelaide jail and asked the head warder for a donation too. And of course he said no, and at that point she said, "Well, you can let my cell because I'm not coming back."
And Sarah Francisco never did return to the Adelaide jail again. She spent the next 4 years volunteering at the Salvation Army and living with friends Susie and William Roberts. Despite all the troubles she had lived through, she managed to turn her life around before her death on November 2nd, 1916. Sarah's burial was provided free of charge by the undertaker, and many people came to pay their respects to the infamous Sarah Francisco.
Even though Sarah's death was a tragic part of Port Adelaide's history, her story still lives on in the heart of Port Adelaide.